Hiya. Welcome back. You're going to be here for about 6 minutes. I'm going to talk about why people self-injure, specifically about why I self-injured. Obviously recording from home under lockdown, so there may be some background levels of noise. I self-harmed for at least 20 years because it made me feel better. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. It made me feel better in a number of different ways. And I'm going to talk about this in really general terms. It's worth spelling out that self-injury is very complex, it's very powerful. It varies not just from person to person, but also from culture to culture, era to era. And I am talking in very simplistic terms. I'm also talking according to very Western models of understanding. And I'm thinking specifically about self-injury as a response to distress, as it is for me, as it is for most people. Something that people do when they're in intense distress, and that generally has three categories of function. The first being that it's a response to too much feeling. The second being that it's a response to too little feeling, a response to dissociation or numbing, cutting off, dissociation, depression. And then thirdly, self-injury is a way of trying to communicate. Now, of course, somebody might move quite rapidly between all of those functions, and I certainly did at times, but primarily for me, self-injury was a means of expression, communication, and a way of coping with intense, overwhelming distress. Why was I so distressed? Well, there's the million-dollar question. For me, the most useful explanation is that I had a number of adverse childhood experiences. I grew up in difficult circumstances. I was the youngest in a single parent family. There were things about that childhood that were fantastic. There were some things that were awful. And by my teenage years, I'd experienced physical violence, sexual abuse, and sexual violence. I'd also not experienced any of the forms of support that you might expect a child in those circumstances to receive. By the age of 15, as a young gay person, I was actually feeling very alienated and judged by the very people who you might expect to provide support. By that, I mean teachers, church, community, family. I was growing up in a fairly strict religious culture, as you can tell. By the time I reached young adulthood, I was dealing with levels of intense distress, and I was dealing with them almost entirely on my own. I did that through very individual, private coping strategies, things like eating disorders, self-harm, self-injury. And I often self-injured by cutting myself, sometimes by taking overdoses. Self-injury, it helped to lessen my distress or help me to cope with my distress by distracting me. It gave me something else to focus on, something that was very compelling at every level. It was also something that I was in control of. I made the decisions about whether I hurt myself, how I did it, what extent I did it to, how I responded to it afterwards, who I told, and in a context where I felt really powerless in other ways, both in terms of my circumstances and in terms of my internal mental state. Having that sense of power was actually really important. Self-injury also gave me a sense of relief, a sense of release. It gave me a way of letting out some of this intense pressure and stress and anguish that built up inside of me. And after I'd done it, sometimes I would be able to sleep, I'd be able to eat, I'd be able to drink, to function, to take care of myself, to be gentle with myself, in some ways to offer myself some comfort. So yeah, distraction, relief, release, control, self-injury for me was a way of coping. It was also a method of communication. It was a way of making real and visible and tangible how I felt on the inside, making, if you like, emotional wounds real in the form of physical wounds. And the first person, the most important person I was trying to communicate with was me. It was me. I needed to see and understand and have a way of making sense of what was going on for me. Self-injury did that. Snap, I can see my outside matches my inside. I can see that I'm struggling. I can see and honor and understand the fact that I need some help, that I'm in pain, that I'm in trouble, that I'm also brave and capable of healing. As time went on, it also became about trying to seek that support and that understanding from other people, trying to communicate the levels of distress that I was experiencing, trying to communicate some of the needs that I had, because for a number of different reasons, I wasn't able to express it in words. If you like, self-injury offered me a very powerful, very articulate physical language for expressing distress. But I'm going to finish by acknowledging that I've been talking about the positive functions of self-harm, the way that it helped me to cope, the way that it helped me to express myself. And it's really important to acknowledge that self-injury comes at a high price. There were some very high costs associated with self-injury in terms of stigma, in terms of risk, injury, pain, illness. And in our next section, we're going to be thinking about some of those risks and how we might minimize them. One of the biggest costs for me was the sense of shame and the stigma that I experienced, and the fact that although I self-injured to try to be understood, actually, in many ways, it closed down doors of communication. Lots of people didn't understand and didn't want to see or listen. So the result for me, as well as pain and risk, injury and scarring, was also a sense of alienation, secrecy, shame, stigma. And it feels important to name that, having named lots of the positive functions. Also, I wanted to name the positive functions so that you could understand why people self-injured, why I self-injured. Thank you for listening.